What's up, guys? Welcome back to the MMA meeting. I hope you guys are having an amazing day. A lot we gotta talk about, man. That last fight night card with Jan Blachowicz versus Aleksandar Rakic was actually a pretty good one. Beat expectations on paper. And regarding that main event, I have to give credit to both guys. Both Jan and Rakic were getting kind of criticisms for their most recent fights. When Jan fought Glover, something didn't seem right about him. And he even said it himself, it's just like one of those nights where a fighter is not on point. Things were not clicking together for him that night. And as for Rakic, wasn't pulling the trigger against Thiago Santos and even some of his other previous fights. But they showed up when they fought each other. They improved, and that's so great to see from both of them. Rakic was pulling the trigger. He was attacking with the 1-2 combo and being successful with his jabs. He was throwing big kicks as well. And Jan was coming down the center with those blitzing combos, but they're looking a lot sharper. He's polishing his punching technique on the front foot, where he's a lot better on the back foot or kind of just standing in place. And it just keeps going to show you, fighters should not be throwing leg kicks at Jan like that. He is impervious to leg kicks. It's almost impossible for fighters to land them consistently against him. Fighters are hurting themselves and wasting time kicking his legs because he's checking all of them and he's beating them kick by kick. He's attacking their legs and they don't have the same kind of defense that he does. Jan is an automatic leg checker. And it doesn't matter how powerful you kick or how fast you kick because he fought Rakic, who has the most powerful kicks probably in light heavyweight division's history. And he also fought Israel Adesanya, who kicks extremely fast. He's great with his timing and he's long as well. Rakic's legs were getting torn apart. Almost all of his kicks got checked and he was getting leg kicked consistently from Jan. And Izzy was slowing down in the fight because Jan kept checking his leg kicks. Fighters need to adjust to this. They know that Jan Blachowicz is going to automatically, instinctively check leg kicks. He's just too good at doing it. Knowing that, there's traps that can be placed. Fighters need to start thinking outside the box here and play 4D chess with Jan Blachowicz. Instead of attacking his legs, they need to fake them now. Knowing that Jan is going to look to check them, they can capitalize from that. When you know your opponent's reactions and reflexes going into the fight, there are traps that need to be set now. There needs to be some game planning going on and you need to change things up that other fighters aren't necessarily doing. So fighters need to start faking leg kicks and capitalizing off of those opportunities because Jan is going to kind of sit still there. He still has a check left hook there. So potentially a straight right down the center is going to pay dividend, or they can go to his body instead with a left hook. Given that the fighter is orthodox, right? And they always have to keep the right hand up if they're going to go with that left hand to the body. Because Jan might try to hit them with his own left hook. So if you can guard that at the same time you're attacking his liver, that's going to be some excellent stuff there. And Aleksandar Rakic could have easily have done that. I mean, he's very versatile when it comes to his stand-up. He's a great kicker and he's a decent puncher. So he can make that kind of thing work. And maybe fighters moving forward are going to be able to see this kind of thing. You cannot kick Jan's legs like that. And after that, does he get the title shot? Does Jan Blachowicz, in fact, get that second title fight? Or is it Magomed Ankalaev? Glover said if he gets past Rakic, that he gets the title shot next. So if the champion is calling out a specific opponent, and it somewhat makes sense, I can see it getting put together because also Magomed Ankalaev did not have a good performance at all in his last fight. He did not look great. So perhaps he's going to need another performance while Jan goes out there and fights Glover or Jiri Prochazka potentially. Both those fights are going to be fantastic. I would love to see how Jan re-performs against Glover and really shows up right because on paper, Jan should be able to win that. The wrestling is still going to be an issue though. And Jan is nowhere near the jiu-jitsu artist that Glover Teixeira is. As long as he can keep it standing and not get pushed back by Glover's stand-up or the threat of the takedown, he should be pretty good in the fight. If he gets backed up, things are going to be pretty dicey for him. And if he fights Jiri Prochazka, it's really going to have to depend on how Prochazka looks when he fights Glover. If he could defend Glover's takedowns, Jan could be in trouble against Jiri. Jiri has some of the most insane power I've ever seen out of light heavyweight. He's so unpredictable, you never really know what he's going to do. Jiri says he goes out there in a game plan, but at this point, it really looks like he improvises a lot in fights. Combine that with his attributes and his mindset, Jiri's a dangerous fight for everybody in this division. Nobody is safe against him. And in that fight with Glover, that fight's a one and done. Whoever gets the first shot in there, whether it be the takedown or the punch to the face, that fight's over. I do not see that fight going past the second round. Glover just doesn't have a chin to be able to take Jiri's punches like that. And Jiri's ground game, although not bad, takedown defense really needs some work. He is not anywhere near Glover's level when it comes to grappling. Nowhere even close. He will absolutely get smothered and finished. Either he gets mounted and ground and pounded or choked out. So if Jiri lands the first punch, he potentially wins the fight. If he gets taken down before he's able to do that, he's probably going to lose the fight. So it potentially will end in the first round. Man, just thinking about it gets me on the edge of my seat. I cannot wait to watch that. Jiri's also like one of my favorite fighters to watch. Such a fun character. If they promote him correctly, I don't see why he couldn't be a star. He has the look, he has the fighting style, he has the knockouts, he has the interesting personality. He's not necessarily a trash talker, but at least he's interesting. And that English is weird because he actually does not have a bad accent when he's speaking English whatsoever, but he doesn't have a good vocabulary, so it sounds weird. If he'd be walking in the United States, everybody would think he's from here. And what about Michael Johnson? Can we talk about Michael Johnson for a second? How is this guy doing what he's doing? So firstly, his record is 20-17. He has 20 wins and 17 losses. Any casual fan will look at that and be like, oh, this guy's trash. Actually garbage. Little do they know who he has beaten and who he performed well against. The best way to describe Michael Johnson is, he's like the best fighter in the UFC. Sometimes. He's the kind of guy that would beat Francis Ngannou one night and then lose to CM Punk on another. He is the perfect fighter of someone who can beat anybody in the world and also lose to anybody in the world. Something's going on mentally with Michael Johnson that's not allowing him to perform against like the lesser level competition. When he's fighting good fighters, he actually performs well consistently against them. When he goes up against fighters that he should beat, he loses to them. It's weird. Like he knocked out Dustin Poirier in 2016 in the first round as well. 2-punch combination puts Dustin out. We haven't seen Dustin go out like that since he fought in the featherweight division. So this was Dustin with a good chin and rejuvenated in the lightweight division. He got starched. Edson Barboza got beat down by him, standing. I remember Michael Johnson was talking about that fight. They were like, oh, you guys all think Edson's the fastest fighter? Watch what I do to him. And he proved he was faster. He proved he was a sharper puncher. He KO'd Gleison Tibau back in 2013 pre-USADA. He beat Tony Ferguson. And he actually beat the greatest Artem Lobov. I'm just kidding. But he did beat him, which is funny. He almost knocked out Justin Gaethje in his debut. Twice. He hurt Khabib more than anybody else ever did. Khabib even admitted it after the fight. He said, I got hit once in my career. And that was by Michael Johnson. He performed very well against Nate Diaz, but he fell into the mind games. They had a bit of an issue before the fight. They got in a little bit of a scuffle, and it looked like Michael Johnson was very emotional fighting Nate. He almost beat Beneil Dariush. People don't even remember that fight. Dariush, I believe, is in the top 6 or top 5. Johnson almost beat him. So look at the fighters that he performs against. But then he loses to Stevie Ray, old Clay Guida, Darren Elkins, Reza Madadi, Miles Jury was pretty good back in the day, Jonathan Brookins, and in these fights he didn't even perform well. Michael Johnson will always be that enigma, like the kind of guy that will show up when he fights the best, but he doesn't show up when he's fighting the worst. Oh, one interesting thing that I found from Luke Thomas, actually. Luke Thomas, he posted a clip of Ciryl Gane actually playing in a celebrity football match, or soccer if you're from the United States. And people that don't know much about football I feel uncomfortable. Do I call it football or soccer? Because a lot of you guys are actually watching me from all over the world, and I think most of the world calls it football. So, okay, I'm gonna call it football, just to make it clear. For people that know about football, being taller and heavier puts you at a disadvantage usually. A lot of football players are actually shorter or lighter. You'll have some tall guys but are pretty thin. I believe Ronaldo may be like one of the biggest. For all of you football heads, you guys probably know someone else that's bigger and that defies the odds and stuff. But a guy like Ciryl Gane who's like 6'4", 6'5", weighing like 240 to 250 pounds, to see him dribble around and move so lightly with the ball is insane to watch. The guy is actually out of his mind athletic. And there's another clip of him playing basketball. Dude, Ciryl Gane could have done anything. He could have played any sport he wanted if he put the time into it. He hasn't even been competing in combat sports that long. His 11th professional fight in MMA was against Francis Ngannou. He was the interim champion by his 10th professional fight. That is extremely rare. His Muay Thai record was 13-0. He looked amazing throughout his Muay Thai career and amazing throughout his MMA career. And he hasn't even been doing it that long. His first amateur Muay Thai fight was back in 2014 when he was 25 years old. His first professional Muay Thai fight was in 2016 when he was 27 years old. The guy is extremely new to fighting. And I'm reading right here, he was actually a footballer back in France as well as he played basketball in his youth. but he took a lot of time away from sports to work in a furniture store. This gives me a lot of confidence in his future in the sport. The guy is going to be learning at an incredibly fast pace. He has the potential to go down as the greatest heavyweight of all time when you regard his skills and what he could possibly do in this division. I know it's very soon to say something like that, but looking at his talent, his athleticism, how skilled he is, his fight IQ, and the fact he's 32 years old where the average age of a contending heavyweight is like 36, he hasn't even hit his prime yet. In the future, it wouldn't be crazy to see him do some incredible things in this division. And guys, there's something I really wanted to talk about. Now, I had a little debate. It was actually a very long debate in person. A good one, an interesting one, but Johnny Hendricks, pre-USADA Johnny Hendricks did not punch harder than Tyron Woodley. And I can understand why so many people still believe this, but not only did Johnny Hendricks not punch harder than Tyron Woodley, his power was absolutely overrated, and that's my stance. We were debating on who punched harder, but actually it stemmed off of, was Johnny Hendricks really on steroids? My whole argument in the beginning was, no, you cannot prove that Hendricks was on steroids, but I did believe he probably was. If you ask me the question for my opinion is he might have been on something. But can I prove it? No. And that's one thing I always stayed away from. I never want to claim that certain fighters are on roids or something when they're not proven to be. I mean, look at Kamaru Usman. If anybody looks like they're on roids and performs like they're on roids, it's the welterweight champion. But I can't say he is. He looks like it, but I can't say that he is. And also, remember when Jose Aldo was starting to lose fights once USADA came along? He got knocked out for the first time in his career, got TKO'd twice in a row, he looked horrible against Volkanovski, looked bad in the rematch against Max Holloway. Everybody was saying that he was on roids. Back in that day, everybody was saying that the reason why Aldo is losing and he looks so bad is because USADA came along, and that's why he was able to go down to the bantamweight division, because he wasn't on the juice anymore. So he lost muscle mass, he lost size. That's why I never want to say certain fighters were 100% on something. As for Johnny Hendricks, most people believe he was on something, but we can't say for sure. And then the whole discussion went to about punching power. His power went away. But I was like, wait, not necessarily. Johnny Hendricks' power was extremely inconsistent throughout his career, even pre-USADA. There would be fights where he's hitting guys with all he has, even clean. For example, when he fought Robbie Lawler, and it does nothing to them. They're laughing at his punches. Literally laughing at his punches. If you really hit that hard, the guy's not going to be laughing when they feel it. No one's going to be laughing if they eat Tyron Woodley shots. And number two, the power is just overrated. His power was overrated. That's not to say that he doesn't hit hard. Johnny Hendricks for sure hits really hard, but people still today believe like he's the hardest punching welterweight of all time, and that is definitely not true. The real hardest punchers of the welterweight division are like Rumble Johnson when he was somehow able to make the weight class. Still have no idea how he did it. Paul Daly, maybe Abdul Razak Al Hassan. Like these guys are the real hardest punchers in welterweight history, but they weren't successful. So when we're talking about championship level hardest punchers, like the elite guys that were able to hit hard, Tyron Woodley's the hardest puncher. Even if you count the pre-USADA Johnny Hendricks, who may or not have been on roids, doesn't really make much of a difference. Woodley still hits harder. When people think of Johnny Hendricks' power, they only look at 2 fights. Because of 2 fights, people believe that Johnny Hendricks was the hardest puncher in welterweight history. Everybody's got 2 fights where they knock somebody out. For sure, those 2 fights show his power, and also like the Charlie Bredeman fight and his UFC debut. Like for sure, they'll show his power, and even able to hurt GSP with an uppercut. But it was not as consistent as Tyron Woodley. When Tyron Woodley would hit guys, they would consistently fall or get hurt. There was 2 fighters that Woodley was able to hit clean in the UFC, and they were able to take him. And coincidentally, those 2 guys are known to have some of the best chins in UFC history. Carlos Condit in his prime, and Kelvin Gastelum in his prime. 2 guys notoriously known for having good chins. So it's not a shocker that Woodley couldn't knock these guys out with 1 punch. When you go to the Jay Huron fight, dropped him with 1 punch. Josh Kasha got obliterated. Darren Till for the first time in his career got dropped with 1 punch. Damian Maia dropped with 1 punch. And one of the only punches that landed clean in the entire fight. Wonderboy Thompson dropped like 3 times inside 2 fights, and like the only 2 times he actually got hit clean with power. And he one-shotted Robbie Lawler. And yeah, Woodley did hit some guys that didn't have a great chin, but so did Johnny Hendricks, glass chin Martin Kampmann, glass chin Charlie Breneman. And Hendricks even had a hard time putting Breneman away. I mean, didn't Breneman get one-shotted by Danny Castillo? I mean, come on, man. The only tough guy that Johnny Hendricks put down was John Fitch. And John Fitch was known to have a good chin, but it wasn't like lights out compared to Robbie Lawler or compared to even Darren Till. I mean, Darren Till's taken a bunch of shots in his career from hard hitters like Robert Whittaker. and able to stand up, whereas John Fish got dropped 3 times by GSP. And GSP doesn't punch that hard. I mean, he's a decent puncher, but you would never regard GSP as one of the biggest punchers in the welterweight division. And when John Fish would get hit, it looked like he was on a roller coaster. And they had mutual opponents. Not only did they both fight Robbie Lawler, and Johnny Hendricks fought for 10 rounds and could not even hurt, to the point where Robbie was laughing at his punches, like literally getting hit in the face and laughing. If you really hit that hard, the other guy's not going to be laughing when they take your shots. Certainly was not laughing when Tyron Woodley hit him. And by the way, Woodley one-shotted. They both did fight Wonderboy. Hendricks didn't really hit Wonderboy. Tyron Woodley, whenever he touched him with his power, Wonderboy looked like he died. But people don't even know they also both fought Josh Koscheck. And Josh Koscheck actually almost beat Johnny Hendricks, unironically. And Hendricks hit him with some powerful shots. Even at one point in the first round, Koscheck actually lowered his head into an uppercut and ate it. Yeah, it shook him up a little bit, but did not even come close to knocking him out. When Tyron Woodley touched him, Koscheck was done. It was over. Yeah, that was pre-USADA Hendricks that fought Josh Koscheck. That was actually right after the John Fitch fight. Yeah, immediately after the John Fitch fight. People forget that fight was in between those 2 knockouts. The John Fitch knockout and the Martin Kampmann knockout that perpetuated that Johnny Hendricks is the most powerful welterweight of all time. It was because of those 2 fights. People don't remember what happened in between that, where he could even hurt Josh Koscheck like that. And Koscheck was never known to have a great chin. There's nothing going for Johnny Hendricks to prove that he hit harder than Tyron Woodley. They had a mutual opponent. They had 2 mutual opponents. Hendricks went to a decision with both guys, where Tyron Woodley knocked both of them out. Not only that, you could even look at the evidence of, the consistency of power, like I said before. Almost everyone that Woodley has touched, he has hurt when he actually connected with his power punches. The other thing is, look how fighters approach these 2. Even though Johnny Hendricks had those 2 fights that he showed he had power, people still did not approach him with the same kind of fear of that power like they approached Tyron Woodley. Fighters were avoiding Woodley's right hand like it was the plague. With Hendricks, fighters were going after him. Robbie Lawler went after him. Wonderboy actually went after him a bit. He actually went into boxing range with him, where he did not want to do that with Tyron Woodley. GSP was the only fighter that kind of stayed away from the power, was a little bit more careful of it, out of everybody that Hendricks has fought. With Tyron Woodley, everybody avoided his right hand. The only fighters that really went after him and were not as intimidated of the power, you could say Rory McDonald, Kamaru Usman, Colby Covington, Gilbert Burns, and Vicente Luque. And most of those fights were Woodley getting older and also attacking him using the wrestling. A lot of guys did not want to approach him when it came to the striking. Actually, the only guy that went after Woodley punch for punch in close range was Gilbert Burns and somewhat Vicente Luque. Everyone else put him at a range or wrestled him. And even with Robbie Lawler, Robbie went after Hendricks in 2 fights. When he fought Woodley, strangely enough, he was backpedaling away from him. Fighters knew about the difference in power between these 2 guys, and they had mutual opponents to show that as well. Take any version of Johnny Hendricks, and Woodley is outpunching him. There actually isn't much of a debate to it, in my opinion. When it comes to top 5 fighters or, championship level fighters, Tyron Woodley is probably the hardest puncher in welterweight history, certainly in the UFC. And Johnny Hendricks is probably not even number 2, probably not even number 3, if I'm gonna be honest here. Usman has an argument to hit harder. Even Gilbert Burns has an argument that he hits harder. So there's 2 things that I cannot stand: racism and Johnny Hendricks over-exaggeration. And speaking of racism, what about that coach, man? He actually defended his stance. He needs a PR team, because that was not the right move. At least like a lot of these celebrities give these fake apologies, that would have been infinitely times better than doubling down on what he said. And why is it always Andrea Lee's corner? What's going on there? And with that, let's go right to our first question. We're going to start with the members EHMT1. As soon as your content posts, I'm watching. Thanks for what you do. What are your thoughts on Dan Hardy fighting Diego Sanchez after 10 years of teasing a comeback? I feel like Dan is cherry picking. It's a weak move in my opinion. Yeah, I don't really understand the Diego Sanchez fight, because Dan Hardy was saying for years that he wants to come back with the right opponent that makes sense for him, competition-wise, as well as other values, to bring him back into the fight game. I don't know if Diego Sanchez is something a lot of people are going to be excited about. It's not like a big money fight or anything like that, and even stylistically, on paper, it should not be competitive, especially today's Diego Sanchez. If we're talking about prime Diego, that's a different story. But Diego that's been through all the trauma with the coach, trauma to his body and everything, yeah, I can see what you mean. Pick a Diego Sanchez at this stage of his career with everything that's happened to him. It's kind of strange, in my opinion. And has he really been teasing it for 10 years? And then with Dylan Gibson, this is the one a lot of you guys were asking me about. If Charles is able to beat Islam, would that mean that he would probably be able to beat Khabib as well? Islam and Khabib can seem similar on paper, but they are in fact different kind of fighters. They use the same kind of tools, but for different reasons, and in different ways. When it comes to the stand-up, Islam is a lot more defensive, and when it comes to the ground game, he's a lot more patient, whereas Khabib is crazy aggressive with everything he does. Khabib is definitely better with ground and pound. The submissions are close, but Islam is more focused on that route. He's more focused on establishing positions so he can go and choke you out or grab your arm or something like that. Whereas Khabib will smash through positions to get what he wants. I would say overall Khabib's ground game is more effective than Islam's, whereas Islam isn't really getting touched on the feet. He hasn't been fighting high-level fighters, but his defensive stand-up style is really great when you look at his footwork, when you look at his ability to slip punches, evade most of the things that opponents throw at him on the feet. It honestly looks like it might be promising even against the top fighters in the world. Some of these guys are going to have a hard time hitting him. Charles Oliveira beating Islam does not mean he beats Khabib, because Islam will take steps back away from the opponent. Not the way Khabib used to, where he would disengage and then re-engage quickly. Islam would literally back away from you sometimes, allowing the opponent to pressure him a little bit. And Charles Oliveira is definitely going to go after Islam. He's definitely going to look to pressure him with his boxing, his long reach, pumping out jabs, and really trying to establish that right cross. And that uber aggression might get Islam to panic shoot. That's something that's interesting here, because Islam does not really fight too many guys that pressure him in that kind of sense. A versatile striker with a longer reach, just marching them down. With the kind of firepower that Oliveira has, with the precision behind his punches, the variety of his kicks and knees, is going to cause Islam to be a bit uncomfortable on the back foot, and that could cause him to panic shoot. If that ever happens, there's a huge probability that Charles grabs his neck and chokes him out. If Islam does not set up his takedowns correctly at the right time, he might get submitted on the feet or from the stand-up. How that's different from Khabib is, it's a lot harder to pressure Khabib backwards. Automatically, it's going to make it harder for Charles Oliveira to be as effective on the back foot as he is on the front foot, because Khabib might be the guy that's going to be able to push Charles back a little bit, maybe not in the first round, because there is a pattern that you see in some of Khabib's fights where in the beginning, first roundish, he will back up from you. Ali Quinta push him back to the cage. Conor McGregor push him back into the cage right in the beginning. And I believe Oliveira might be able to do the same against Khabib. But Khabib is not a counter puncher the way Islam will try to do sometimes. Islam will look to backstep and counter you with his left hand, and he is a southpaw fighter, which opens up his left hand a little bit better. That's probably why he has a little bit more confidence to counter you backwards. Whereas Khabib will just look to get away from you. Sometimes he'll throw a lazy left hook and stuff, or a jab, but he's really looking to get back to the center of the octagon and reverse the pressure to the opponent. But I've been saying it for years. The key against a lot of these guys like Khabib and Islam is pressure. You have to push them back. And it's not only for you to set up your own shots, but it takes your back away from the cage. And if Islam Makhachev or Khabib were to shoot on Charles Oliveira in the center of the cage, or where their back is on the cage, there's a higher chance that Charles chokes them out. They won't be able to use the fence as a means of defense against some of these chokes. And for an example, if Dustin Poirier got a deep choke on Khabib, imagine what Charles Oliveira could do. Islam is a lot more patient and calm with a lot of things he does, so his shots will not be as reckless as some of Khabib's will be, which means that he might be even harder to submit, but he might be easier to knock out than Khabib. So the stand-up against Islam is probably going to favor Charles Oliveira more than it will than if Charles stood up with Khabib, and it could possibly be vice versa when it comes to the ground game. Islam might be harder to deal with because of his patience and calmness and how great he is defensively, compared to Khabib, who's a lot more attacking and will create more openings for Charles to capitalize on. And remember, because Islam is a southpaw fighter, Charles' best strike is that right cross and the front kicks, of course. It's going to give Charles even more favors in the fight. So stand-up wise, Islam can be in a lot of trouble, whereas Khabib might be able to get away with things. And Islam is not a sloppy fighter or a chaotic fighter when it comes to his stand-up. He doesn't do things that just throw his opponents off. Khabib will do things like that. He will look kinda sloppy, but in that same way, he offsets his opponents all the time because of how awkward he is. Islam is not necessarily awkward. He actually tries to be a lot more technical when it comes to his stand-up, and that's detrimental. That's very bad going up against Charles Oliveira. Against Charles, you probably want to make it a little bit more dirty. You probably want to make it a little bit more awkward because Charles fights by the fundamentals. His striking is clean and technical. Fighting him in that same manner and not being as technical as he is, not as powerful as he is, not as sharp as he is, there's going to be very little chance for that opponent. So to answer your question, no. If Charles beats Islam, does not mean he beats Khabib, but there are different openings for Charles against each style. And ultimately this revolves around, would Khabib ever even come back? And this question has been thrown around a little bit, and I believe Khabib was just asked this by Brett Okamoto, and he said he doesn't know. Later he said, no, he's done, just leave me alone. But before that, he said he won't know how he feels if Charles beats Islam, especially if the fight's going to be in Abu Dhabi or even perhaps Brazil. Let's say the craziest scenario. He goes to Abu Dhabi to fight Islam. Islam's like, no, I want to fight you in Brazil. And Charles is like, no, I'm the champ. I want to fight you in Abu Dhabi. Imagine that scene. He comes out to a full crowd, 17,000 people in Abu Dhabi, all supporting Islam Makhachev, yet again coming out as an underdog. Khabib is in the corner, and Charles Oliveira sleeps Islam. Let's say he chokes him out on the ground after beating him up on the feet, stands up over the crowd, gets on the mic as Khabib is in Islam's corner, and Oliveira calls him out. That would be an eternal, legendary scene. It would be something we would never forget. I believe that's the only way possible that Khabib would want to come back. Avenge his friend? Actually seeing that there is a guy that's challenging his lightweight greatness. If Oliveira beats Islam, he's in consideration of being the greatest lightweight of all time. The call out would be absolutely perfect, as Khabib is right there in the cage. I don't know how a fighter would be able to pass that up. It'll be so much interest in the fight. I believe it's the only way Khabib would ever even consider coming back to the sport. I don't actually think he would come back. I think he might be done. But man, seeing your friend get slept like that and knowing that that was his chance to become a champion and he failed, and now that guy's calling you out after he's just slept your longtime friend that you've been training up to this moment, I don't know how you could pass it up. If I were in his shoes, I don't know if I would be able to pass that up. And that fight could possibly draw over 1 million pay-per-view buys. It'd be one of the biggest MMA fights of all time. And perhaps that's the real Tony Ferguson versus Khabib fight. It's actually Charles Oliveira versus Khabib. And then go to Naresh Mokonte. If Michael Chandler moves up to the 170-pound weight class, how do you see his chances up against the top 15 fighters? Chandler's not a small guy at all. I mean, he's kind of short, 5'8", 5'7"-ish. But man, that guy's stocky. He loses to Shavkat. He's just way too small there. I say he beats this version of Santiago Ponzinibbio, but it would be pretty difficult. He beats Li Jingliang, pretty much out-wrestles him. Beats Jeff Neal, definitely beats Michael Chiesa. Beats Neil Magny in a 3-rounder. In a 5-round fight, it's pretty dicey. It can go either way. Loses to Sean Brady. Beats Jorge Masvidal. Beats Wonderboy, wins by wrestling. Vicente Luque. Now this is interesting. With the right kind of game plan, I could definitely see Chandler winning. Kind of taking something that Bilal Muhammad did against him. Luque didn't show really good takedown defense. He's too easily hit. And against someone like Michael Chandler, you definitely do not want to get hit. Especially Chandler at 170. Imagine like a 190-pound Michael Chandler punching you in the face. That's going to be some different power, man. I don't know if Vicente Luque is going to be able to take those. He's very durable. He has a great chin. But the wrestling and that, I could definitely see Michael Chandler winning this. But Luque is bigger. He has that left hook. Any kind of collision between the two could potentially end Michael Chandler, so it's back and forth for me. He beats Bilal Muhammad. Bilal's not taking him down, and I don't think he's as sharp of a striker, and he's not dangerous enough of a striker to pose any threats to Chandler on the feet. Gilbert Burns beats Chandler. Khamzat beats Chandler. Leon beats Chandler. Colby and Usman, they all beat Chandler. But the Colby fight is pretty close in my opinion. I think in a 5-round fight, Chandler's not going to be able to keep up with him. Also, rank these fights according to the levels of hair-pulling frustration. Rose versus Carla 2, Ngannou versus Lewis, Yan versus Jacare, and Adesanya versus Romero. Well, Yan versus Jacare is the least. Had more action than all those other fights. Then I would say Adesanya versus Romero, given that there is a bit of a strategy to that. Like real strategy. Adesanya did what he had to do to win the fight. He knew just leg kicking from a distance and not getting too close would give him the victory. And we did see one big left hand land on Adesanya, so that's going to be the second least frustrating fight. Then it's Ngannou versus Lewis. Very boring, but there is a bit of understanding that these two guys did not want to get hit because one shot would probably end it. And at least it was 3 rounds. We had to watch Carla versus Rose for 5 rounds. And 2 fighters who have less power than the other fighters we mentioned. And the worst of all, the most frustrating thing of all, was hearing the corners telling their fighters do nothing, reinforce the genius game plan of doing nothing. So not only were the fighters frustrating to watch, the cornering was even more frustrating to watch. P.S. Thanks for the tips on boxing for beginners. You have finally convinced my wife to train in the gym with me. Oh yeah, from your last question from the last podcast. That's great to hear, man. I hope you guys have a fun time. Don't try to spar too much. Learn the fundamentals, learn the basics. Learn the technique. Footwork comes first. Then you throw the jabs and all that stuff comes after. And the main thing is have fun with it. Learn some cool stuff. And if it's a good gym, you're going to make some friends there, man. A lot of the gyms I went to, there was always like this community that always grew in there. Then we go to Cool Cat. What is your take on the recent Scalegate? Should the UFC start considering to either implement electronic scales or any other solution in order to avoid these types of situations in the future? Every fighter should get scales in their own rooms, so they all have their individual scale that nobody else can tamper with. That would help them tremendously. Like in every single hotel room for every fighter, they should be given or told to bring their own scales. There is one other issue if the fighters bring their own scales, in that some of them might not be calibrated correctly. Like, some scales are not accurate. So perhaps them being supplied scales would fix any kind of issue for any fight falling apart or something. Because of course the organization doesn't want any fights to fall apart or a champion to be stripped for something that happened to Charles Oliveira. That was horrible. Nobody wanted to see that. I think that would be great, and something that Dana said as well, having like a security guard or someone just to watch the scales, that is going to work as well. Regarding what happened to Charles Oliveira, I mean, it seems like someone messed with the scale. And if you look at the weights for every fighter on that card, I think like 4 or 5 people actually made weight, where everybody else was over the weight, like a half pound or something. They were given the pound allowance, of course, but not for Charles Oliveira. I mean, he weighed similarly to what everybody else weighed on the whole card, which is kind of interesting. So a lot of people say, why did Charles miss and nobody else missed? Well, there was another fighter that did miss weight. Everybody did kind of miss weight. They were just given the pound allowance. Charles wasn't. So the way I see it is, it doesn't seem to be his fault. When you look at his response to what happened on the scales, he honestly looked shocked that he missed weight, and his coach did post a day before that Charles was on weight. So it's unfortunate, man. If they could give him his belt, that'd be great. If they don't, hopefully he still gets pay-per-view points for his next fight. If he gets that, then nobody else cares. Everybody looks at Charles Oliveira as the rightful champion. Even Khabib said the same thing. Khabib was trying to get Islam that fight, is even saying that Charles Oliveira is the champion. How funny is that? Look how much of a 180 has been made. Remember when Oliveira first won the belt, nobody said he was the real champ? Everybody said that Dustin Poirier was the real champ of the division. He was the real number 1 guy. Now that Oliveira doesn't have the belt, everybody's saying he's the real champ now. Completely turned on its head, man. And I'm all for it. It seems like Charles Oliveira is the only fighter that can bring all hardcore fans together. Like, who doesn't like this guy at this point? Everybody I know is a Charles Oliveira fan. Then we go to Yusuf Cisse. Hey Weasel, I can't help but notice more similarities between Justin Gaethje and Michael Chandler. The latest one being that both fighters won their debuts, lost their next 2 fights, and then won the next after losing twice. Also, I'm seeing Michael Chandler learn from his mistakes little by little, although there are still some mistakes that he's making. My question is, can you see Chandler's trajectory be similar to Gaethje's by winning the next couple fights, eventually getting another title shot? And at the same time, can you see Chandler becoming a better fighter offensively and defensively? Or do you think he will stay the same? You have to also note that they are both champions from other organizations that came into the UFC and right away fought ranked contenders. Now, if Chandler could get another title shot, that all depends on who his opponents are, because styles make fights. There are certain fighters in the top 5 that he can beat, and some that he's going to have a hard time against. He should absolutely destroy Beneil Dariush. And I feel bad about that, because it feels like everybody's picking up Beneil Dariush. The hardest fight might be Dustin Poirier. Oliveira is a winnable fight. Islam Makhachev is a winnable fight. Gaethje's a winnable fight. Him fighting Dustin would be a difficult one for him. That's the one I would be more confident in Dustin winning. So yeah, there is a path that he can take to get back to that title shot. Let's say he goes and fights Beneil Dariush, as Islam goes and fights Oliveira. Chandler wins that one. If he gets a quick knockout, he might just get a title shot right there, as no one else is deserving. If Oliveira goes and beats Islam, and Chandler goes and knocks out Beneil Dariush, who's to say that there isn't a rematch between the two? Because Gaethje for sure doesn't deserve it. Who knows what Dustin's going to be doing? I guess we'll see what RDA is going to be able to do in that short amount of time. I could see if Chandler knocks out Beneil Dariush and Oliveira beats Islam, we might just get a rematch, because that fight was close and nobody else would deserve it more than Chandler. Now, will he get better offensively and defensively? I don't think by much. I think we're seeing the final product of Michael Chandler. I think this is the best he's ever going to be. That's the thing about older fighters. It's hard for them to learn anything new, especially when they are successful in the cage. So I see Chandler definitely being the same fighter, always. There was a period of time where he did change a lot, and that was like, 3 or 4 years ago or something? It's hard for me to see him change again at like 36 years old. The thing that we might see more from Chandler is him wrestling. Actually mixing his wrestling with his striking more than ever before. That is something we could definitely see from Chandler, because he is a well-rounded fighter. He could do everything. But we're just seeing him in these slugfests a little bit too much. Look at that takedown he got on Tony Ferguson. He could have probably got that earlier in the fight. He didn't attempt on Dan Hooker. He could have easily done so. He would just have to avoid the knee. Against Oliveira, it was tough for him to shoot a takedown, and against Gaethje, that takedown defense is just too strong against Chandler's style of wrestling. So moving forward, We might see Chandler use his wrestling against Beneil Dariush. We might see him just look to knock him out on the feet, maybe because Dariush might be too dangerous on the ground. I don't see him trying to take down Islam if they were to fight. Against Dustin Poirier, he might actually want to take Poirier down. That's the way we're going to see Chandler probably fight in the future, using all of his skills. Then we're going to Bradley Hartley. What's the best way to explain to somebody that MMA is not barbaric and that it is a sport? So I found it pretty difficult to actually get people to understand that MMA is not as barbaric as it seems to be. Cosmetically, it looks more brutal than other combat sports such as boxing, for example. But these are just the people that probably don't even care to understand that. If people are looking at MMA as barbaric, they're usually hard-headed in that way, and you can't really transition them to believe that MMA is actually a sport. Like, there's an artistic value to it. You got stories, there's a lot of emotion into it, and you really get to appreciate that side of MMA when you actually understand what's going on in the fights. When you understand how difficult the techniques are to actually execute, and you start to learn about the game plan that goes around it, the weight cutting, the preparation that goes before fights, that's when you start to really appreciate the sport aspect of MMA. But the thing is, a lot of people who think of it as barbaric, they don't know any of these things. They don't know how hard it is to throw a flying knee with the perfect timing to knock somebody out. When they see it land, they just look at it as, oh, that's so brutal. But they actually don't know how difficult that actually was to do. Honestly, the absolute best way to show someone that MMA is in fact a real sport is if you kind of teach them how techniques actually work. This is what I was able to do, and people were able to start to think of the sport differently. Teach them to throw a 1-2-3 combination. They're going to struggle so hard in throwing it, and if something clicks in their head like, wait, this is actually really hard, and why do all the fighters that I watch on TV make it look so easy? Most people don't know how to throw a proper punch. And when you're teaching these extremely basic things to them and you tell them, this is just step one. You don't know how to do the footwork. You don't understand the other kind of punches that go into it, the different kind of combinations you could throw together, the switching of stances, the ability to read opponents' movements, and when to throw these specific attacks. It's not just you throw punches and they happen to land. These fighters see when to throw them and they game plan around all this. And at the end of the day, scientifically, MMA is less dangerous than other combat sports. When you show them the stats of what's going on here, how many serious injuries has happened in MMA compared to boxing or wrestling, for an example, it's far less. When you start to explain to them that the purpose of boxing is just to punch a guy in the head 200-300 times in a fight, that is gradually going to increase the trauma to their brain to the point where they're not going to be the same person anymore. In MMA, fights are called off very quickly. The thing I see a lot of people who don't watch MMA, when they see a fight where someone gets knocked out and then hammer-fisted when they're dropped or something, they look at that as the most barbaric thing about the sport. When they see someone finishing the other opponent off, that is honestly the biggest part that turns a lot of these people away. But logically speaking, in boxing, someone gets dropped that way, they're let back up to get dropped again, perhaps to get up again, now they're dropped for the third time. The damage is far worse, probably even 3 times worse compared to MMA fights, given how many times a fighter is knocked down in boxing. Now, cosmetically, when it comes to the cuts and the lacerations and stuff, MMA is worse cosmetically, but when it comes to the brain damage, which is actually the most important part of it, it's not nearly as bad as boxing. And then your next question, do you think that Justin Gaethje's lack of jiu-jitsu will really start to be exploited? Because yes, he's hard to take down, but fighters could just grab onto his neck like Charles tried, or body lock, and switch to the back like Charles did against Dustin Poirier. Or can Gaethje just adjust and show that he's smarter than that? Thank you for the awesome content. Thank you so much for the question, man. Justin Gaethje's jiu-jitsu has been exposed years before he came into the UFC. I did make a breakdown before he fought Khabib, and I showed everybody the weaknesses to his jiu-jitsu back when he fought in the World Series, and even when he fought Michael Johnson. People don't even remember when Michael Johnson took him down after rocking him. Gaethje gave up his back and tried to stand up. He does that always. Way before he got submitted, Gaethje was showing that he's a wrestler purely when it comes to his grappling. He most likely had the mindset of, why do I need to train jiu-jitsu when nobody can take me down? That's the only way I could honestly see him never training jiu-jitsu like this. He probably trained, of course, but what he's been showing everybody, there's no way he's been doing it for long or taking it that seriously. So at this stage of his career, I mean, how much longer does he have in the sport? Taking so much damage. The wars that he entered the UFC with, that trauma is going to stay with him. He just got knocked down, almost looked like he got knocked out by Oliveira's right hand. And at this point, how non-existent his jiu-jitsu skills actually look, I don't even know if he has the time to catch up to these guys. And moving forward, everybody is going to know, if I get Gaethje down or I just break his balance somehow, I'm going to be able to choke him out. Most fighters in this division will be able to submit Justin Gaethje with the right position. And then with the Mark Fletcher, what do you reckon Dominick Cruz could have done in the sport if it wasn't for all of his injuries? Dominick Cruz would have been the greatest of all time with like 20 defenses, 3-weight champion, just breaking records left and right. I mean, the amount of time this guy was injured was a total of, I think, 5 years, 6 years. The majority of his prime was spent with injuries. And that's a shame because at his peak, he was one of the best fighters in the entire world. When he beat Demetrius Johnson, who later went on to be the most successful UFC champion in history and one of the greatest fighters of all time, he got injured. 3-year layoff, came back to fight Takeya Mizugaki. So from 2011 to 2014, he missed out from being 26 years old to 29 years old. That whole gap was completely missed in that time. So he knocks out Takeya Mizugaki and got injured again for a year and a half. So from 29 years old to like 31, there's a gap there too. So a lot of those prime years were missed. And then after the Cody Garbrandt loss, he was out for another 3.5 years. Came back and fought Cejudo and got TKO'd. So from 2016 to 2020, he missed out from being almost 32 years old to 35, 36 years old. He spent more time laid off than active in the UFC. And he's still regarded as the greatest bantamweight of all time. For a little amount of time he had fighting in the UFC, he did so much. Imagine if he never got injured. Imagine if he was fighting 2 to 3 times a year of those like 7 years off that he had. That's like a total of 14 to 21 fights that he missed out on. Actually insane when you think about it. He was supposed to fight Renan Barão. He would have fought TJ earlier. He would have fought multiple different guys up there. I mean, it is kind of a bummer if you are a Dominick Cruz fan, to be honest. And then with the GGB, when it comes to MMA, it seems like there's offensive skills and defensive skills. With that being said, it seems like Charles Oliveira has to be one of the most offensively skilled fighters. If you did a top 5 pound-for-pound fighters ignoring defensive skills, who would you include? Yeah, Oliveira might be the absolute best offensive fighter in the entire UFC. And there are fighters who are better defensively than they are offensively. This is just throughout all combat sports. For an example, Pernell Whitaker back in boxing was a defensive juggernaut, but his offensive skills were not up to par, which is why he had some close fights out there that shouldn't have been close. For an example, when he fought Julio Cesar Chavez, he won that fight. But the fact that he didn't have so much output offensively, it made the fight closer on the cards. So top 5 pound-for-pound offensive fighters in the UFC. Number 1 is Charles Oliveira. Number 2 might be Max Holloway. Number 3, I would say Alexander Volkanovski. Number 4, Robert Whitaker. And number 5, perhaps Kamaru Usman. And then with the Hydro OG, the GOAT list you posted on Twitter last year was the following. Number 1, John Jones. 2, GSP. 3, DJ. 4, Jose Aldo. 5, Khabib. 6, Kamaru Usman. 7, Stipe. 8, Fedor. 9, Anderson. And 10 DC. My question is, what would you change about your list from last year? Or is it still the same? Love your content, keep up the good work, man. I do probably change the GSP and John Jones order. I would put GSP as number 1 and John Jones as number 2. I did think about it, and actually shortly after I posted that list, I started to think that GSP should have been above John Jones. DJ, I would still probably have as number 3. Jose Aldo, number 4. Khabib now, number 5 compared to Kamaru Usman. I would actually have Kamaru Usman above Khabib. Then Khabib is number 6. Stipe number 7, Fedor number 8, Anderson number 9, and I'm going to have to probably take DC off the list and put Henry Cejudo as number 10. Then we go to Jesse Griffin. When Cejudo sent that tweet that Adesanya would be light work for Khamzat, DC made a response video saying that Adesanya is a nightmare matchup for Khamzat due to Chimaev's pressure and Izzy's counter-striking. He then went on to say that Adesanya is a nightmare matchup for himself and Kane for the same reasons. Thoughts on this? Could Izzy pick those 3 guys apart, or would he succumb to their pressure and get beaten down in the clinch out on the ground? I'm very curious how you think Adesanya matches up with DC and Kane. Thanks again for the amazing MMA content. You have the best MMA channel on the internet. Keep up the great work. Thank you so much, man. That's high praise. Super grateful for it, man. So Cejudo and DC have differing opinions, completely differing opinions. Is Adesanya light work for Khamzat, or would Adesanya pick Khamzat apart? I think DC has a bit of a recency bias because he says that Adesanya would beat his pressure with his counter-striking. Khamzat's not going to strike with Izzy. He did that with Gilbert Burns because he kind of had to. He didn't have to brawl it out, but he had to stand with him. He doesn't have to stand with Izzy. So in the most basic form of analyzing the fight, Cejudo has more correct things to say there than DC. Now it all comes down to, can Chimaev take Izzy down? Can he actually get in on his hips? Can he cross those distances without getting touched? Well, we do know that Chimaev has an insane chin, a granite chin, and Izzy's going to have a hard time putting that guy down if he connects on him. So how he's going to stick off his pressure? Chimaev is also very fast. Super fast for a middleweight. Probably can match Izzy's speed. And the other thing is, they're almost the same weight. If Chimaev grabs a hold of Izzy, I find it hard that Izzy stops the takedown unless it's against the cage, because Izzy's takedown defense there is much better than in the center. In the center, Chimaev takes him down no problem. And on the ground, Izzy gives up his back always. Chimaev is just going to ride him out, throw him around, probably even try to get his back. So, the fight is, no matter what, going to be difficult for Adesanya. I won't say it's light work, given the fact that Khamzat will get tagged, he will get punched in the face on the way in, and he potentially could have some takedowns get thwarted against the fence. But ultimately, I do see Khamzat taking Adesanya down and winning the majority of the fight. If it goes into the 4th and 5th rounds, does Khamzat have the cardio to keep up with Adesanya? Well, here's the thing. Adesanya is not a high-volume striker. He's not going to put pressure on Khamzat. So Khamzat's going to actually be the one that's going to dictate the pace of the fight. And that's excellent for a guy that doesn't have the greatest cardio, because they can kind of adjust the way through. If he's going too fast early, he can kind of slow down a little bit, because Izzy's pace is relatively slow for the majority of his fights, especially if he's going up against a wrestler where he's going to have to mind the takedown. So they're both not wrong, but I do side with what Cejudo was saying there. Now, DC said that Adesanya would be a nightmare matchup for himself and Kane. He's pretty much saying that Adesanya would stylistically be hard for DC and Kane to beat. I think more so Cain Velasquez, because Kane's head movement is kind of obvious, it's easier to track, but those wrestling styles are just tough for Izzy. Neither of these fights are going to be easy. Nightmare matchup, that means like there's very little chance for DC and Kane to win. And I do not think that at all. I think DC is actually a nightmare matchup for Izzy, whereas with Kane it can kind of be back and forth, given that Kane doesn't go for submissions, he doesn't get the back and stuff, so Izzy would have more leeway to get out from under him and pick him apart on the feet. So Izzy has a good style against Kane, but not against Khamzat and DC. And then we go to the public questions, and we're going to start with the most liked comment by Princess Lioness. Hey Weasel, I know you said that Petr Yan was the most skilled fighter in the UFC, but seeing how he did against Sterling and him constantly giving up his back, how does he do against the other high-level grapplers in this division like Merab, who's on a 7-fight win streak, and Umar, who is undefeated? Thank you so much, I love your content. That's an excellent question. Now, what I was saying was, fundamentally, Petr Yan is the most skilled fighter in the UFC. I say him and Volkanovski overall might be the most skilled fighters. But fundamentally, Petr Yan does everything correct by the textbook, except we did finally get to see that chink in his armor, and it took Aljamain Sterling to show it everybody. Petr Yan gives up his back when he gets taken down. I don't know how regularly this is going to be, or if it's just like a one-fight thing that we saw from Yan. Maybe he underestimated Sterling and didn't expect him to take his back, so he just tried to stand up. Who knows moving forward, but it is something that we saw, so we have to take that into consideration when we're talking about his skills. Now, there's a bigger thing against Yan than his actual techniques, and that is perhaps his fight IQ is not as high as we thought it probably would be. He lost that fight against Sterling for the fact that he started way too slow. It took him 2 minutes to land his first strike in that first round. That is not good. At least just pump a jab. Like, just tap him with something. And if he does fight Merab, or he does fight Umar, if he fights TJ Dillashaw, people forget how good of a submission artist TJ is. Extremely quick to get your back. Petr Yan may be running into more problems against guys that he's overall more skilled against. If he constantly gives up his back the way, Justin Gaethje does, you don't need that high level of a grappler in order to grab his back. So potentially against Merab, it's dicey territory for him. Merab is probably the most tenacious wrestler in the whole division. He's like a bantamweight version of Khabib. And if he shoots 10 times and only secures 2, that's all he's going to need to try to get his back. Same thing with Umar. Now, Umar has more weapons when it comes to his stand-up that can mix in the wrestling a lot better and a lot sneakier. Him as well, he gets the back. That fight is over for Petr Yan. And Umar is at a stage right now where he's still progressing and he's only going to get better at it. So in the future, Umar Nurmagomedov might be the nightmare matchup for Petr Yan. And that's scary, man. I'd like to see how Petr Yan does against other big-time grapplers in this division. And then we go to the Takashi guy. What style of fighting do you think has the most longevity? For an example, Usman was known mostly for his dominant wrestling, but the wear and tear of such style has forced him to level up his striking. Khabib retired early, so we don't know if that would have been the case for him as well. Obviously, brawlers like Nate Diaz and Justin Gaethje don't have a lot of longevity. Then there are distant strikers like Wonderboy or Izzy, but that style relies on a lot of reflexes that start to go away as you get older. Obviously, there are more styles, but these are just the examples to hopefully make my question more understandable. Love the content, by the way, keep it up. I love this question, man. That's a great one. What style has the most longevity? It's honestly going to have to be the wrestlers that can mix up their jiu-jitsu, that have strong grips, great takedown opportunities, and an ability to stick on top of the opponent and just destroy them from there. We've seen it for an example with Glover Teixeira. Glover Teixeira became much more of a striker when he first got into the UFC all the way till he got a title shot. Once he started to get back to his roots and just look to take down the opponent instead of just boxing it out with them, he has so much more success, even at his older age. And yes, the wear and tear could be something when it comes to that style, that over time that is, but at least that's more on the body than it is to the brain. You don't need to have those fast reflexes always, like distant strikers do. Distant strikers are the most safe when it comes to brain damage when they're young. When they get older, it's probably the worst style to avoid brain damage. Brawlers, of course, are always going to have the shortest longevity. They're putting themselves in the fire. They're going to get hit sometimes. They're going to hit the guy sometimes. Unless they have like a gifted chin like Nate Diaz, you're able to stick around a little bit longer. But those are the kind of guys that usually get wiped away from the sport quickly. They have a quick, explosive burst onto the scene. Everybody's talking about them, and then they're done before you know it. Now, the thing about Usman, you said that Usman had to change up his style because of the wear and tear of wrestling. I don't know how true that actually is. I think it's more stemming off that first Colby fight that he knew, okay, I gotta really get better with these hands. Because a guy like Colby Covington, who's not that great of a striker that can neutralize the wrestling, exposed a lot of Usman's shortcomings when it came to his boxing. It perhaps could also be the wear and tear, but as I know, he's had bad knees for years. I think even before he came in the UFC. But I honestly do think that the wrestlers that can mix up different forms of grappling in their offensive pressuring style have the most longevity in the sport. When you look back at Randy Couture, when you look at Glover Teixeira, when you look at Clay Guida, even if you look at Damian Maia, who's more predominantly Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu than he is a wrestler, but he still had that same kind of style. So ultimately, that's what I do think it is. I would love to say Muay Thai fighters that have great takedown defense and good jiu-jitsu, but that's just given too much. That's like the perfect fighter. Because overall, you do see a lot of Muay Thai fighters stick around for so long and have so many fights without being injured over and over again. But in the sport of MMA, you don't see a whole lot of them last that long. And then with the Ted Baker, to what extent do you think being past your prime is directly related to getting older rather than the sport catching up with you skill-wise? Fighters get older, so their skills decline in the sport. It's not that the sport caught up to them. That is a direct past your prime phase. Someone just gets older. Then the fact that the sport catches up to your skills. Now, technically, you're not past your prime. You are still in your prime. Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor is the best example of a fighter where the sport caught up to his skills because he took so much time off. Dominick Cruz can also be seen as the same thing. Anderson Silva, when Chris Weidman beat him and then he started to lose fights, same thing. The sport caught up to them. They themselves didn't necessarily look worse. When you just look at them fight, they don't look worse, it's just that the opponents look better. So that actually will not say is past your prime. To the fighters that the sport catches up to, it's usually their fault for taking so much time off, not being as careful when it comes to injuries. I mean, sometimes things happen, so it's not always in their control. And there's also fighters that never really adapted anything new to their game. It took Anderson Silva a long time to bring new stuff into his skill set. He kind of fought the same for so many years. His opponents were only going to get better. The younger guys are creeping up. You need to adjust with the game or it's going to leave you by. And then with the Lizard Wizard. Between the 1FC method of scoring fight as a whole, the UFC Bellator method of scoring round by round, and Pancras style, a point pool, which would you say is the better method of determining the actual winner of a fight on the scorecards? Also, if you decide the UFC method, then which era's method was the best? P.S. Love the breakdowns and recommend them to everyone. Can we get some more who really won on older fights? Yeah, that'd be great. I just don't know which one you guys want to see. But out of those three methods, which one is the best? If you do a point pool and you judge the fight as a whole, that is probably the best out of all three. Round by round is bad. I don't like round by round. No round is equal. If they were able to differentiate and use more numbers so we can get a more accurate judgment of each round, that would be something. But there's too many 10-9 rounds. There's just too many of them. The perfect example, when Israel Adesanya fought Robert Whittaker the second time, that first round was scored a 10-9 for Adesanya. Yeah, the round where he dropped Whittaker, and it was the most one-sided round of the entire fight. That was a 10-9. So were the other rounds where they were extremely close. See, that doesn't make any sense. So right from there, I do not like that method. I do not like round by round. The best is fight as a whole using probably a point pool. And if you do a point pool, I think it would have the fans more engaged. Like they can actually see who's winning? That was a great question, man. Then we go to Michael Scalzo. Hey Weasel, is it just me or is Trevor Wittman overrated? I get that he's a great striking coach, but can't help but to feel as though he gets multi-dimensional fighters, mainly Rose and Justin and Usman a little bit, and turns them into one-dimensional inside boxers. Rose used to have slick BJJ and never uses it anymore. Justin and Usman never use the wrestling anymore either. Also, Rose and Justin's outside boxing kicking game has looked worse lately. Both whiffed and almost fell down from throwing from outside boxing range in their last fights. Thanks, man. Love the content and live Twitter reactions. Thank you so much, man. You could think of it this way. I mean, Trevor Wittman's been around for a while, and now he's being recognized when he has extremely talented fighters like Rose, Justin, and Usman under him. Usman was already kind of a product that he was able to mold the striking with. I mean, he has insane wrestling skills, great attributes, just a fantastic foundation to build boxing out of. Justin, he just had to like polish some things and get him to be calmer. And as for Rose, her boxing is tremendously better. We have to say that. Her boxing is so much better than what it used to be. Her footwork is excellent. Some of the best footwork out of any fighter in the entire roster. But not only is her BJJ different, she was super slick. People don't remember Rose back in the day when she would like jump into armbar. I mean, she looked almost like a Charles Oliveira out there. I'm not going to say as skilled as Oliveira, but she was super aggressive with her submission attempts. Nowadays, she just tries to get up from the bottom and get back into her boxing. And not just that, her kicks are not even the same. She does display some good kicks out there, but there's a lot of potential that's not being unlocked. Rose has more potential in her kicks than she has in her punches, yet those are just not used that much. It's crazy. She has super flexibility with her kicks, and she comes from a taekwondo background before anything else. How she's not folding people with body kicks and kicking out their legs and head kicking them all over the place, I don't understand. And it is kind of funny because before the UFC, Justin used to actually wrestle. A lot of people don't know that. Justin Gaethje actually used to attempt takedowns. Once he got into the UFC, and even a little bit before that when he was like the top guy at World Series of Fighting, he stopped wrestling. And I don't know if that was a time when he went with Trevor Wittman, but he stopped wrestling altogether. I think he only shot one time in the UFC, and that was against Eddie Alvarez. So the argument is, and I'm seeing it a lot lately now, Trevor Wittman is a good boxing coach for MMA fighters, but not necessarily a good overall coach for MMA fighters. I'm not going to say that because I don't know. I'm not in their gym. I don't know how the training is going. I don't know what he's teaching them specifically, but we can kind of figure a lot of their training is revolving around boxing. Then with Ajax, why do you think American wrestlers abandon their wrestling more than Caucus wrestlers? I think it has to do with a lot that American wrestlers never really have any other kind of training. They never train in boxing until they get into MMA or something. So they fall in love with their hands. For a lot of the wrestlers from the Caucasus, a lot of them learn other stuff. A lot of those Sambo guys get into combat Sambo as well. They're throwing punches and kicks. So from a very young age, they're learning this stuff. They're learning how to box. They're learning how to kick. And they don't just fall in love with it all of a sudden where they were wrestling for like 20 years without throwing strikes. So it's something new that they fall in love with. Other than that, I don't know if it's a discipline difference. Maybe the wrestlers from the Caucasus are more disciplined and not getting away from what they know. But a lot of the wrestlers from the Caucasus that we see in MMA, they've been striking for a long time as well. None of them are really just wrestling only. I think like one of the only guys that we know is Khamzat Chimaev, but even him, who was wrestling for the majority of his youth, he had some combat Sambo fights when he was young. Where wrestlers are like going through college, if they want to chase the Olympics and stuff, they'll be in their mid to late 20s by the time they get into MMA, and the boxing they learn becomes like a new toy to them. Then we go to Princess Lioness. Hey Weasel, now that Khamzat has been tested, and we have some questions answered about his game, how do you see a fight between him and Shavkat going now? Who do you think wins, by how, and by what odds? Thank you so much. I love your content. Now it gets more interesting. I was asked this same question before the Khamzat and Burns fight. But now that fight showed us a lot more of Khamzat's game, this potential fight with him and Shavkat becomes a lot clearer. We're going to have to see more from Shavkat, but we do know a lot more about him than we did before Khamzat fought Burns. Shavkat is a much sharper striker when it comes to his precision with his timing, him being calm, he's a better counterpuncher. All of that has been shown to us already. Will he be taken down by Khamzat? Potentially, but he's extremely dangerous when it comes to his submissions. Potentially his guard game could be somewhat threatening. We just have to see more of it, and that's ultimately what it's going to have to come down to. The biggest scare for me for Shavkat is him getting clipped because of the way he holds his head up high sometimes without putting up a guard, or sometimes where he doesn't even move his head at all. And potentially Khamzat could be able to catch him from a distance, but Khamzat gets so reckless with his right hand. I believe Shavkat will be able to get away from it. I think he will be able to use his footwork to create some distance away from that and look to counter him. And we do know that Khamzat does not check leg kicks. Shavkat's going to be slamming that lead leg all day. There's going to be body kicks in there as well. There's going to be some front kicks to the face, spinning attacks. And Shavkat's the kind of guy who's so well-rounded, he's not going to be so deterred from throwing kicks like that. His jab is going to be on point. Khamzat, I believe, has a better jab, though. But everything else, Shavkat just looks better on the feet. We just have to see more of his grappling to really understand how his guard is, his ability to scramble out from the bottom, and all of that stuff. If he could defend all of Khamzat's takedowns the way, for an example, Aleksandar did, Khamzat would be in trouble. They went to Kami Klein. How would these lightweight fights go? Chandler versus Poirier or McGregor? I think Poirier beats Chandler. I think Chandler beats McGregor. Fiziev versus Ferguson. I think Fiziev beats Ferguson. And RDA versus Gaethje. I'm going to lean RDA, but that's a good fight. That actually should be the next fight that goes down between them two. Keep up the great breakdowns. They're sick. Thank you so much, man. And then the last question, we're going to go to Sohagia. How does a champ of each division do against the top 5 in the division up? Keep up the good work, Weasel. Thank you so much, man. So like a lightweight champion versus the top 5 of the welterweight division. Deiveson Figueiredo loses to Marlon Vera, loses to Corey Sandhagen, loses to Jose Aldo, loses to TJ, loses to Petr Yan, and loses to Sterling. Aljamain Sterling now loses to Korean Zombie, loses to Kelvin Kattar, loses to Yair, loses to Brian Ortega, loses to Holloway, and loses to Volkanovski as well. Volkanovski now beats Beneil Dariush, but very close fight. Loses to Michael Chandler, loses to Islam. I can see him beating Justin Gaethje. Loses to Dustin Poirier, and also loses to Oliveira. Now as for Charles Oliveira, beats Bilal Muhammad, loses to Gilbert Burns, although that would probably be a close fight. Loses to Khamzat, loses to Leon, beats Colby Covington, and loses to Kamaru Usman. I think Charles Oliveira might be a nightmare matchup for Colby. Now for Kamaru Usman, beats Paulo Costa, beats Sean Strickland, again, beats Derek Brunson. Close fight with Marvin Vettori. I can see it going either way. I'm going to lean Vettori because of how much bigger he is. Loses to Jarek Cannonier, definitely loses to Robert Whittaker, and loses to Adesanya, but that it's a close fight. Now as for Adesanya going up to light heavyweight, beats Anthony Smith, loses to Ankalaev, loses to Rakic, Jiri Prochazka. Okay, this is a good one. I say he beats Jiri. I think Jiri's just a little too wild in the open. Loses to Yan again and loses to Glover Teixeira. Now for Glover Teixeira moving up to heavyweight, he beats Derek Lewis, loses to Curtis Blades, beats Tai Tuivasa, loses to Stipe, loses to Ciryl Gane, and loses to Francis Ngannou. Now for Carla Esparza, she beats Alexa Grasso, beats Tyler Santos, but close fight, loses to Jessica Andrade, beats Lauren Murphy, beats Caitlin Chukagian, and loses to Shevchenko. Now for Shevchenko, she beats Caitlin Vieira, beats Raquel Pennington, beats Irina Aldana, beats Holly Holm, beats Amanda Nunes, and beats Juliana Pena. She is probably the only champion that would beat the entire top 5 and the champion of the next weight class. And that is the end of the podcast, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to give it a like, subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the bell, and I'll see you guys in the next video.